Hello, and welcome to Why Make, the podcast where we talk with artists about why they make, with me, your host, Eric Wolkin. If you'd like to learn more about Why Make, please go to our website, why-make.com. Also, please consider supporting the Why Make podcast by again going to whymake.com and clicking the donate button. All donations are tax deductible through our fiscal sponsor, Fractured Atlas. On this episode of Why Make, we have Jim Roberts, a percussionist, producer, artist, and educator who resides in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Jim plays the drum set, djembe, and congas, has many recordings under his belt, and he just finished a 17-year teaching stint at Elon University, where he taught percussion and directed the Elon World Percussion Ensemble. Jim's journey in percussion dates to his earliest days playing in band class, to marching band, to drum and bugle corps, and to African music, traditional fiddle music, and so much more. I'd like to welcome Jim Roberts to the Why Make podcast, the second musician to grace the podcast.
I just want to thank you first for having me. This is quite a pleasure and honor to be here.
So we're going to start with an evolution of the Why Make question, because I always start the Why Make question with, what's your first memory of making something? But now that we're talking to musicians, I think it needs to be amended as, what's your first memory of making music or doing something musical?
How about if we go back to the question that I was prepared to answer, which was your first creative act?
Oh, I like that as well.
We'll get to the music. It's close behind, but this is an important question, and this is one that I prepared for. And I actually, I didn't have to think long because your memory only goes back so far. So my first memory of doing something creative was in kindergarten. And in that time, one of the things they had us to do was to finger paint, right? So I remember looking at what I had done thinking, oh, that's terrible compared to the other kids. And it obviously it probably wasn't, but it's probably where some insecurities began right there. But what was very interesting is that I was cleaning my drawers recently, and I came upon something that I was shocked to find. And I'm hoping that maybe you can take a picture of this.
That's exactly what I'm going to do.
But this is that finger painting that I found in my drawer. And I was just shocked that I would still have this, or I have no explanation.
And you were, what, 5 when you did this?
Yeah.
That is an excellent finger painting. I have no issues with that finger painting whatsoever.
And not only that, it's listed as Jimmy, which is what I was called most of my life before I got into college. But it says 1964 to 1965, the Highland Presbyterian Kindergarten. And there is the trip to the train station, the Halloween story, Christmas at kindergarten. And actually, this picture here, I think I'm the very first one in line.
Oh, well, here, let's further document this.
So these were some creative people to start with, just to find all these things to do for us. In 65, I was 5, and in July, I turned 6. So, and then there's just all this other pictures, and then it has a thing here, creative play. And again, there I am in this creative play picture. I don't know exactly what that play was. It wasn't dance per se, but it was a dance. It looked like it just looked like movement,
And where was this? Where did you grow up?
This is I spent one more year there, but this was in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And these pictures, this is the picture, used to be on the Polaroid that had the date of the pictures. And it says it here, May 1965. At least that's when they were developed. So, and actually these were supposed to be religious experiences because it was a church. So it was a whole different kind of religious experience. But that was my first memory of a creative act. My first creative act is something I don't remember, but I was relayed this by two independent sources. One was my father and one was my aunt. And they told me this story not at the same time. My father had passed away when my aunt told me this very same story, that I used to crawl on the floor and beat on the pots and pans underneath the sink. So somewhere in there was some inclination toward sound and rhythm. You can't put a price on that. It's just something that was innate. I was very lucky to be able to pursue that my whole lifetime. So I'm sure that in those first years, at some point, singing may have been involved, certainly listening to the church choir. But my mother played the radio in those years. And you're talking about 64, 65, 66, 67. And so what's on the radio? Well, the Beatles are on the radio and all kinds of sort of pop music like that. But I specifically remember the Beatles. And I also remember them because my mother bought me 45s. So that by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I had a stack of, and that was Beatles and Tommy Rowe, Jam Up and Jelly Tight, just all this stuff. And so I had a basis for the musical part early on, and neither of my parents were musicians. They couldn't sing, they couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, as they say. I would be embarrassed standing by them in church sometime, listening to them sing hymns. But they always had music around, especially my mother.
I think that's one of the wonderful universal things about music. It's a language and it's an emotion, and you don't have to be musical to appreciate music. Moving along with your story, you have worn many hats as a musician. I think
that's true.
You're a professional musician, professional gigging musician. You're a teacher. You're an audio engineer. Why don't you just give us sort of the brief highlights of, go through 50 years and take as much time as you want.
Well, I don't want to bore anybody, but I'll give the synopsis. Is essentially having that background in music that I just described. Pretty early on, I knew I wanted to be in the band, the high school band. And I do remember that when we moved from Fayetteville to Clinton, which was the day I got out of the first grade, that year, or maybe the year afterwards, I saw the band at the Christmas parade. And I remember standing on the side there, young boy, and watching the band go by. And then the drummers, and the drums were so powerful and amazing. And then everybody's playing, and all of a sudden, everybody stops playing except for the drummers, and they start doing the cadence. They just continue right on with the cadence, and I was like, man, that's cool, And it's interesting that I think about that and talks about creativity of how things trigger you as a kid. One of my one or two earliest memories is the funeral for John F. Kennedy, which was in November of 1963. It was a 3-day event, that funeral. And the thing that stuck out to me, again, was the drums. And you can go back on YouTube and you can find footage of that drum. You can find exactly what I'm talking about, is that when they did the cadences. But unlike the happy Christmas Eve thing, the drums in the Kennedy thing were very somber. And what I found in researching that was that in the military bands, that what they do is that they lower the pitch, and this dates, I think, probably dates back to the Revolutionary War, I'm not sure, but they lower the pitch on the drums for state solemn occasions because of and you know why? It's the same why you do anything. It's because of the emotional impact.
So they're literally taking the tension out of the drum heads.
Yes. So that was really striking to me. And then not long after that whole event, I remember February of 1964. And that was when the Beatles came to the United States from England and played on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I remember that as well. And so the drummer obviously was, he was wild, and the whole group was wild. Everything was wild. Everybody was yelling, at the top of their lungs. I don't even know how they could hear the music. So I was getting these tastes right away, and those are two of my very earliest memories. The fast forward, we did move to Clinton, and I had, as I said, a stack of 45s of different things. And then I had these ballroom dancing records, and and I had a country western record, which I actually found. I still have that record, amazingly enough. But one thing that happened was that when we were in Clinton, in December of 1970, we moved from what was then Powell Street to another place, Cutchin Street, different house. And that, I think, possibly the next year, or at the very least the year after that, I went off to a church camp in Warsaw, North Carolina. And this was a monumental moment for me musically, because at that time, when you think about let's just say it was 1971, all the counselors at that camp were all 18 years old or so, or maybe younger, maybe 17, 16, I don't know. But they all brought their albums and stuff to camp. And what was very unique about this camp was that in the dining hall there was a record player. And the record player was hooked up to a single loudspeaker on top of the dining hall that blasted out all over the camp. And there was a microphone at the record player so someone could make an announcement, and you could hear it anywhere on that property. So what happened was these kids that were the counselors, in the morning, somebody would go and put on a record, and that's how you would wake up. We were in these like hogans, these sort of open platforms with a little bunk bed in them and a little canvas over them, like a big covered wagon or something, And I'll never forget it, Eric. And this is a startling thing for someone who is, what was I, 11, 12 years old, waking up in the morning and hearing boom, doom, doom, doom. God damn, the pusher, dun, dun, dun. Hearing Steppenwolf on that record, which was called Steppenwolf Gold, was all their hits. And so I'd wake up to Born to Be Wild in church camp. I'd wake up to The Pusher. I'd wake up to The Magic Carpet Ride. I'd wake up to Hey, 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 Lordy Mama. But that's not all I was waking up to, because they had a lot of other records. One very influential record in my life that goes along with that was The Ballad of Easy Rider, the soundtrack of, sorry, not the ballad, but the soundtrack of Easy Rider, which had the song The Ballad of Easy Rider with Roger McGuinn. And so those records those two kind of go hand in hand, because the first two tracks on the soundtrack are Steppenwolf. But then you've got things like Jimi Hendrix's 649, or you've got the Holy Modal Rounders playing Kyrie Eleison, there was a church song, I guess. You had Roger McGuinn doing the Ballad of Easy Rider, and you had, I think, the Smiths version of The Wait. They had some contractual issue for the soundtrack, so the band couldn't do it. But the band is in the movie, right, interestingly enough, which is, of course, it's their song. So you had those two records, but then you had a whole other side, which was James Taylor, Sweet Baby James, which came out in 1970. And it's so interesting. I was just listening to a thing with Russ Kunkel, who's the drummer on that, and Carole King Tapestry and Joni Mitchell Blue, all these great records. And he was talking about recording on James Taylor's record. And that record, Sweet Baby James, was a monumental shift for acoustic music, and it countered that rock thing that was happening in the world at that time too. So that was a huge influence on me musically, because when I came home from that camp, those were the first 3 albums that I ever bought. And I bought them with my own money. And then there were other things like they played Jesus Christ Superstar. That was that's great music. Whatever your beliefs in the world are, there's some great musical stuff in that record. There was Motown in that mix as well. And I had been a fan of the Jacksons, listening to just that. The Jacksons would be on the radio. And of course, the other thing on the radio at that time, I had a little AM radio in 1970. And I was listening at night to an AM station, I think it's an AM station, called WLS out of Chicago. I mean, Chicago to North Carolina, that's a long way for a radio to broadcast, but that was it. And I was hearing not only some of that stuff, but I was hearing Kenny Rogers in the First Edition. I was hearing, that was where I first heard the band. The first band real song that I heard was The Night They Drove All Dixie Down. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks, I mean, how can a bunch of Canadians write a song that's so deep in this, ooh, messed up my mic, so deep in the South, and they were able to do that. But I was also hearing Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, and that left this really uneasy feeling, like emotionally, what's that about, And it wasn't until later, till I learned what was going on and how deep a record that as a concept record.
Yeah, it's interesting because, obviously we're close enough in age. You're discussing all the music of my childhood as well.
Sure.
And I don't know that I understood what was going on at all.
So anyway, continuing on, I did, in the 4th grade, began taking piano lessons because I knew I wanted to be a drummer in the band. And the band director said, if you want to play drums in my band, then you have to have 2 years of piano. Because essentially he didn't want to have to teach us to read music, I think. Or he did teach us to read, but he didn't want the drummers just cutting the fool, because early drum music in bands is so ridiculously easy. The reading, you don't really get anything from that. And you certainly don't get any melody. And so he was wise to do that. And I did. I studied 2 years of piano, and I made the cut. I became a drummer. Right away, that was my single musical outlet until I was about 13, 14, and I bought a drum set for $450. And I still have that drum set. It's still worth about $450, I think. Well, maybe more, I'm just kidding. Then I had a real kit, and every year for Christmas, my parents would buy me a cymbal, because cymbals were really almost more expensive than the darn drum set, and they still are. And I still have most of those cymbals today. So I had a kit, and one of my friends who was 3 or 4 years older than me, didn't live far from me, went to my church. His name was Paul Dempsey. He had a drum set. And I remember going up in his attic bedroom one day, and he set me down, and we just went over a few little basic things, and I was able to sort of work out coordination. It's just, I didn't have a teacher. I didn't have lessons. And this is the bizarre thing, is I didn't have any, even after majoring in percussion in college, I still didn't have drum set training. But I've just finished teaching 17 years of drum set at Elon. So I'm pretty much self-taught with drum set. But it just comes, the creative part of that is just sitting down very regularly, in my case, that time every day, and doing one of two things. I either just play freeform, anything I wanted to play, or what I did all the time was I would put on a record. and I had a little 1 or 2 inch speaker mono record player, and I would try to play. So right away you had to play really quietly or you couldn't hear the music. So that probably helped a bit with musicianship. And all these records I was buying, I was putting on. And I have specific memories of certain records that were important to me. Of course, the first being Steppenwolf Gold. I learned every beat on that record, which was fortunate because the drummer on that record really does a lot of different sort of rock styles. And I remember like listening to Suki Suki Sue, and there's an offbeat on the cymbal bell. Suki 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 Sue. And it's like, how could he play on the offbeat of the cymbal? Well, I sat there, however many days it took, and figured it out. And one day, bam, I was doing it. The unfortunate thing about that is that you couldn't hear the bass very well, so you couldn't always know what the kick drum was. So I had to guess, by the way it felt. But that's how I learned to play drum set, and through that, I found these 2 guys, a guitar player and a bass player, and they both could sing, which is great. And we formed a band called Phoenix. I think I was 14. So I was already in a little power trio, my first band, and we actually had gigs, pool parties and whatnot. I had no training except for marching and concert band. And we were an award-winning high school marching band. Our band director really liked collecting those trophies, and he worked us very hard.
So let's move on to college here. We don't want to go down this rabbit hole a little bit too much.
I think that covers a lot. I went to Campbell for a year, and I studied some mallet, keyboard, but I was studying with a trumpet player. Campbell really didn't have much of a percussion thing going. So when I came home at Christmas, after the first semester, I found one of my friends who I'd been in the drumline with, and he was at East Carolina. And I learned about this guy at East Carolina named Harold Jones, who was known all over the country. And he was the percussion teacher at ECU. And I said to myself right then, I got to get into ECU. I got to get out of Campbell. And then in April, I went and auditioned for Harold Jones, and amazingly got in. And Harold was instrumental in my education in so many ways. He wasn't a drum set guy at all, so I didn't get any of that. And all this other, Pat Metheny, all that stuff came outside of classical percussion studies. But classical percussion studies gave me, number one, proper technique with drumsticks, proper technique on the timpani, on the mallets. It taught me how to play as a melodic person, because very big in Harold's studio was that you had to do solo marimba. And you had to do a lot of solo marimba. That was part of the curriculum. And it just teaches you so much, not just as a drummer, but as a musician, because it gives you all those other things. It's not just about the notes, but it's about the phrasing and the dynamic changes, the volume. We played in East Carolina. It was awesome because you could play in the wind ensemble. I played in the symphony. I played in concert band, and then I was already well versed in marching from being in Clinton, North Carolina. And so it was a 240-piece marching band with a 30-some piece drum section in it. Additionally, I got interested in drum and bugle corps. So I auditioned for the Crossmen, who were then in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and another Southern guy from South Carolina, and we'd go once a month to the rehearsals during the winter, and then tour with them all summer. 2 different summers. I toured summer of 79 and summer of 80 with the Crossmen, all across from Philly to California and back. And as I transitioned out of that, I went to grad school. again, I picked up, a very high level of marimba and that type of thing, but I also got into composition. So important for me, learning more composition. And I started accompanying dance classes with congas. And I didn't really know how to play congas, but I could keep time well, but I wasn't great technically with congas, but I was able to actually be a music director for a short time of a dance company of one of the dance instructors at Northern Illinois University, which is where I was, DeKalb, Illinois. And doing experimental music there, learning how to operate tape machines, and then a Moog synthesizer. And I did all that, and in 1985, I graduated. And then teaching high school band, because you had to have a job, and there was like 2 percussion positions that opened in the country that year, so there was no chance of really, with probably hundreds of percussionists trying to get a job. So I taught high school band, and I was miserable. I was trained to do that at East Carolina. It was kind of a high school band factory in some ways. I had a music education degree from there, but I was just miserable. And then came the story that I really want to tell, which is seeing in the paper one day and seeing that a percussionist was playing in Durham with a storyteller. And all my percussion, I'd never seen such a combination. And remember, this is 1986. So I go to this thing after school one day, and I saw this percussionist, and I met somebody who has become a lifelong friend, percussionist Beverly Bosford, along with the storyteller Louise Kessel. And Beverly was playing all these African instruments, and I'd never even seen some of these things. And I was like, man, I want to learn more about this. And she said, well, if you want, there's this thing that happens on Thursday nights, the Chuck Davis African American Dance Ensemble community class. So anybody in the community could go, and it was a dance class that was being accompanied by West African djembe. So I went. I walked in the door to the little old Watt Street school, and I heard the sound of the West African djembe, which I had never heard before. And I said 2 things to myself at that time. I said, whatever this drum is, I'm going to learn how to play it. And secondly, I thought, God, I have a master's degree in percussion performance, and I'm not a master of anything. So that spring, which was the spring of 1987, I walked into I'd been a band director for 2 years. I hated it. I walked into my principal's office, and I said that I wouldn't be returning in the fall. And he said, oh, great, Jim, where did you get another job? And I said, I don't have one. So that was the change. I made a significant change in my history at that point. But I switched into African music in high gear, and I stayed in Durham until I left in 1995. And that 7 years I was in Durham, North Carolina, was absolutely monumental in how it transitioned me. And this is why you read all these things I've done. This is why it's so diverse, because I did a whole world for a long time. And then I switched gears into a whole other world. And I'm not switching as big now, but I am really pivoting into the songwriting world right now, but not leaving behind any of the African stuff.
I think that's the essence of creativity. The essence of creativity is to continually switch the target and continually hone your skills. There's a great sculptor who's no longer alive, Wendell Castle, and I once attended a lecture he did, and I'll never forget this. He said, if you continually hit the bullseye every time you throw the dart, well, then something needs to change. And we were talking about Joni Mitchell before, and that's one of the reasons why I respected her. She was one of the greatest folk artists of the 60s and 70s, and the next thing you know, she's scatting and playing jazz. And then she's doing electronic music. The restless soul of an artist to continually try new things and fail. Because, ultimately it's about trial and failure, and then getting up and doing it again.
Somehow I knew how and when to transition. It was intuitive. And actually a friend of mine that I recently saw, I haven't seen in a long time, and I was telling her I was starting to do a lot of songwriting. She says, man, you keep pushing. You keep going places. You're not scared to go new places. And she had a lot of respect for me for that. And I appreciated her pointing it out because I hadn't thought about it so much. But it's absolutely true, because when I left Durham, talking about a transition, the other great transition in my life is going to Nashville, Tennessee with nothing but a djembe. Now think about that for a minute. That's almost like walking into an old-time fiddle festival with nothing but a djembe. But I was naked, you know. That's it, pal.
Let's get into the more creative part of this discussion, which is take me into the mind of a drummer. How do you think as a drummer when you're creating a piece, either for somebody else's music or when you're creating a solo piece of your own? How does a drummer think?
Well, the best case scenario is you don't think. I mean, this is important, because it is in that letting go of your brain is where some of the best stuff comes up. Now, obviously, if you have a song that you're playing with, you've got to think of the structure of the song, and you listen to the vibe of the song. Okay, what kind of vibe does it have? Russ Kunkel, for instance, was talking about his James Taylor recording on Fire and Rain. Back in those times, 1970, a lot of people were, rocking it out using sticks, da-da-da. And the producer in that said, well, why don't you, or maybe Russ came out of that, why don't we use brushes? Which in the rock genre, that was a jazz thing. But in the rock genre, the people weren't doing that. And so he used brushes. But it was all because of the feel of him listening to that music and thinking, these sticks aren't going to work. That's a power thing, and we need things that are subtle to match the guitar of James Taylor. So you have to think about music in those types of terms. But once you're actually playing the music and you understand, what the structure, there's only two ways you can go. Play songs you know, play things you don't know, or improvised, right? If you're playing something you know, you've got to know enough of the song to know where it's going. It's the drummer's job to lead you to the next section or to create a thing. In the case of improvisational music entirely, and this is why jazz is such an interesting form of music, is that you've got basically the head, the form of the song, the melody of that form, and that's it.
The head, and then you're going to leave it in the dust.
And that's it. And so Miles was so good with that type of thing, like when he did Kind of Blue, he had a lot of space in that. And he had an extraordinary bunch of musicians that they were in that space because their minds were free. Their minds were not focused on reading, nothing. They were able to intuit that music. They just play. And now, here's an important point. It's one thing for a kid or somebody who doesn't have any experience to get on and play, and they should do that. But if you're a player and you've been playing a long time, particularly if you've been playing a long time, your hands know where to go in some respects, and your ears know how to lead them. Because your ears are the most important instrument you have, not your hands. It's your ears. It's what is happening. If you're not hearing what's happening around you, you can't play properly. And that's the thing I've always been good at, but yet at the same time I've always struggled with, because there are no right answers, right?
Well, and that's interesting because, I definitely don't have good ears, but it's something I'm really working with. And I guess one of the main reasons I ask that is that, I've taken lots of music theory classes. You have to have technique, you have to have theory, and then you have to forget it all. But ultimately, it's about your ears guiding you. And I think probably at least the most important theory in music anybody has repeated to me over and over again. Music is about tension and release. And you get to that point where you built up the tension and then you release it, whether you release it by going back to your root note or how you do it. And I'm just really interesting about how do you deal with that concept of tension and release as a drummer?
It's a feel thing. Ultimately, the most important thing about drumming is what we call the feel. And it's so funny because if you hear any great drummer talking about drumming, they're always going to talk pretty quickly into the conversation about the feel. And you're like, oh, the feel, I feel it, sure, right, what? But actually, that you don't even have to be good technically if you understand feel, if you understand really feel. And it does have to do a lot with the way you listen. And that's often what separates the men from the boys, if you ask me. I remember one time I got interested in old-time fiddle music, and I started going to these festivals. And I went to a bunch of them, and I would just play djembe often. And you would think that a djembe player would get thrown out. And a djembe player certainly can get thrown out. But I learned the essential thing to old-time music, which is the rhythm that the fiddle player and thus everyone else does, which is daka, 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 daka. Well, there is a part of that that's very African as well, and that's when I began to create this idea that these musics could somehow be related, and they are. But at that time, I was still trying to figure it all out. So I wasn't just playing dagat. I was playing. I wasn't just playing this, right? I was, jazzing it up. So I went to the Grassroots Festival in Ithaca on the advice of a friend of mine, and I heard this group there called the Hicks, H-I-X. And it turns out that the fiddle player was a guy named Chad Crum, and he was well known in the old-time world at that time. That was in the mid-90s or so. And I was so excited about hearing them play, I went up to them afterwards and I said, man, you guys just sound great. I really want to play with you, And Chad said, well, we're going to this thing called Clifftop next week. He said, why don't you come to Clifftop and come and hang out and sit in, play some, and see how it goes, which is very open in him. I have to give him credit. So I did, and it ended up, if you've been to Clifftop, you know that there's a porch scene there at the house, and they were practicing at the house there, just sitting there on the porch, and I came and brought my drum, and I'm happily, doing my little thing, and then all of a sudden Chad stopped. And he said, and he was so kind, and he bent down. I was sitting down and he was standing up, and he bent down to me and put the fiddle right next to my ear, and he said, listen to this. And then he played the tune right there at my ear, very softly. But what I realized was that there was a rhythm in the rhythm that I had never heard before. And it was what we call the melodic rhythm of the fiddle. It wasn't the main daga, daga. There was another rhythm going on inside of that, which was the accents of the melody. That's what he wanted me to hear. From that day on, my approach to old-time fiddle music changed, because I realized I wasn't listening to where it would need to be. And after that, I just like a whole world opened me up for that style of music.
This is kind of an odd question, but do you dream drumming?
I have. I mean, you mean like waking dreams or sleeping dreams?
Either one.
I have in both. Yeah. I mean, do I walk around and hear things during the day? Absolutely. All the time. It's, and I carry my phone with me, which has a tape recorder, because now one of the things that I'm doing is doing a lot of actual songwriting with a guitar. And so, yes, when I get little pieces of whatever it is, whether it's a little melody or a little lyric or a lyric and a melody or even a groove, sometimes I just whip out my phone and record it right then and there. Because when you get an idea, and this comes actually down to the core of any creativity to me, is I think that if you're a creative person, that what you are really is kind of an antenna. You're just picking up something that's already there. I don't think you're creating anything personally. I think it's all in the air, and if you're lucky enough to receive, and everybody does, it just depends on if they're listening or not. And if you're in the business of creating, if you don't get it, either get it down, write it down, record it, or tell somebody within an instant, that thought can be gone. And I don't know if you know, but I brought this book that goes way into that idea called The Creative Act, A Way of Being by Rick Rubin. He talks about that in a very clear way, which makes it easy to understand. And you may or may not agree with certain things in this book, but I really enjoyed the fact that he went way deep into the actual art of creativity. And that was the thing that came out, because I realized that I had not been doing my due diligence all of my life of like trying to remember things, as I've taken it for granted, saying, oh, well, that went away, oh, something else will come, and something else will come. However, if you're in the business of trying to mine ideas, which you can then later craft into something usable or more refined, then you've got to get those initial ideas. And by the time you're finished with them, it may have retained that original feel, or it may be completely different. It doesn't matter, really. What matters is that you pay attention to the ideas that are coming to you. And again, this is this thing of letting go of your brain.
Let's talk about your project, The Tao of Time.
Well, actually, I pronounce it the Tao of Time.
The Tao of Time, okay.
I think the Tao of Time is a correct pronunciation as well, but I just think of it as the Tao. That was that exploration all come to fruition. In terms of if you listen to that, I mentioned way back going in a record store and seeing The Dark Side of the Moon, and going through 2 copies of that in high school. Well, that is my version of The Dark Side of the Moon. It doesn't sound anything like The Dark Side of the Moon, but the similarity is that it's a concept record, and it flows from one song into another, into another, into another. It's really good road music. It's really a great thing to put on the road.
And what is the grounding concept?
It is about a Tao being about a journey for me, a journey of time on different levels. When you think about time, well, first of all, I'm a drummer, so there's inherent responsibility of being in charge of the time. It is a record that's also about universal time. When you think, and you can think about, the beginnings of the universe, and there are some very space-oriented things in that. There's actually a song called Universal in that. You think about historical time, like the more immediate, and I focused in on the 60s and 70s, but also in one of the pieces called Past Sense, Pastsense. It's like the past, meaning past tense. but past sense, that this was what people thought were the right things at that time. So for instance, you've got, I pulled all these little clips out, like Truman saying, we bombed Hiroshima, a military base. He actually said that at one point. Yeah. Or there's Amelia Earhart talking about the importance of women. There's quotes from Kennedy in this past sense. There's 9/11. There's Robert Kennedy talking about the death of Martin Luther King. So there's all these different really big sort of events that were impressionable to me in time. And that brings, the whole, the pathway of time into focus of the journey of time. And so there's all these different journeys for me that are happening simultaneously. It's not just me as a drummer, and of course that's there, but it's me and also thinking about this other level of time of your own personal birth to death time. This is something that all people think about. It's like, okay, you're born, well, when am I going to die, or how am I going to die? People, that's going to go through everybody's mind. So there's things in there that relate to that level of time, your own personal time. So for me, this was almost a 10-year project. It took a long time. I recorded all of this myself in a little Amish barn studio that I created, 16 by 24. And so it's a very tight sound. There's not a lot of breathing room for the air, but the recording came out really great for considering the conditions that I had to record it. And it was just sort of my statement on time. And I'm really, really, really glad I did it.
So speaking of time, you've just retired from being an adjunct at Elon.
17 years.
17 years, and now you're moving on to the next thing.
Well, people always ask me about retirement. Well, I mean, I'm just stopping working at Elon. It doesn't mean I'm tired or retired. I'm just not going to work at Elon anymore.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of people don't understand the notion of retirement when you're speaking of being a creative person. It's just the next chapter.
Yeah, there's no retirement in that sense. You do what you do, and people are wondering how you're going to fill your time. I was like, my gosh, I've needed this time so long.
What is the next chapter?
Well, this is all about songwriting. I'm attending a workshop with Andrea Stolpe in August. It's a 5-day retreat west of Nashville, actually west of Kingston Springs.
So let's define songwriting. Are we composing songs, or are we actually writing lyrics?
We're writing lyrics and we're composing music. Guitar, vocal. I mean, I don't call myself a singer-songwriter because the singing part is a little bit dubious. But that being said, that I have improved, but basically I'm trying to get the songs out. I'm really trying to do the writing part. And I've been writing, actually my mother bought me a guitar when I was 14 and I wrote songs then, but I've never taken it seriously in the way that I take it now.
Well, it sounds like you're a driven person, and we've been talking about drive all along, and that's what it takes to be an artist. You got to be driven. You just got to keep on moving and trying to find fertile new ground. I wish you the best in this next chapter. And
in closing, last night I went to the Outlaw Festival in Raleigh, and on that festival was Robert Plant and Alison Krauss. Of course, I grew up with Zeppelin. That's the third time I've seen Robert Plant. The first time in '77 with Led Zeppelin. And also after that was Bob Dylan, right? And it's supposed to have been Willie Nelson, but Willie's been a little under the weather. So his son, Lucas Nelson, did the closing set, and Willie will be back next week. And, you're talking about creativity. I was hugely influenced by Bob Dylan. I mean, Jimi Hendrix used to carry a Bob Dylan lyric book with him around. That's how big Bob Dylan was. I mean, everybody after Bob Dylan was influenced by him lyrically. So I used to teach a course on the music of the 60s and 70s, and we'd do a whole day or two on just Bob Dylan and Greenwich Village and that whole folk scene and how important that was to the 60s and getting everything like really jump-started for what came into my world in the 70s. There's just so many influences and things that made me understand, what's important here is the song. So now here I am. I've started all this wild compositions and I haven't stopped experimenting sonically, because that was a big part of Ancient Hand, big part of the Tao of Time too. There's a lot of sonic layering in those records, Cape Town. But learn to write a dang song.
I'm going to stop you right there because that seems like the perfect place. Learn to write a damn song.
I said dang.
Dang. Learn to write a dang song. And at that moment, Jim Roberts, I'd like to thank you for spending a good portion of your morning and early afternoon with me. And as we always end this podcast, why make?
Yeah, why not? Thank you so much, Eric. This has been just really fun. And thank you for doing what you're doing. It's great for creators.
Why Make is a production of Rob Helmkamp and Eric Wolken, and you can help support the Why Make podcast by going to why-make.com and clicking on the donate button. All donations are tax deductible through our fiscal sponsor, Fractured Atlas. Music for this episode came courtesy of Jim Roberts. They include the song Soul Power from his recording The Tao of Time, and the songs Yema Ya and Trance Dance from his recording Ancient Hand. It also includes a 2024 YouTube clip of the Crossman alumni drumline.
When the spirits rise.